Welcome back to the podcast where we explore how small mistakes, overlooked warnings, and human errors can spiral into devastating consequences. I'm Eckhard Jan, and this is Error 1. Today we're going back to the late 70s, to a time where nuclear energy was the future, until it almost wasn't. This is the story of the 3 Mile Island accident. It's just before 4 a.m. March 28, 1979. In the quiet town of Middleton, Pennsylvania, most people were still asleep. The night air was still. The river that ran beside the nuclear power plant flowed steadily, unaware of the silent storm building within the concrete walls of reactor number 2. The story begins with a simple malfunction. A pump that stopped working in the plant's secondary system, the part responsible for removing heat from the reactor core. In response, a relief valve opened at the top of the reactor's pressurizer. That's normal. What wasn't normal, the valve didn't close again. The plant operators didn't know the reactor was losing coolant. They didn't know that the core was starting to uncover. By dawn, the radioactive fuel rods were exposed. Temperature soared. Hydrogen bubbles formed inside the reactor. A partial meltdown was underway. The reactor didn't explode, but the damage was done. About half of the uranium core melted. But what happened? What led to the worst nuclear accident in U.S. history? Let's take together a look at the error chain again. It's the period after the Second World War. For 2 decades, from the beginning of the 50s to the end of the 60s, they are known as the baby boomer years. The population in the USA was growing rapidly by 34% in these 2 decades. The economy flourishes, Americans were doing well. More and more people bought electrical household appliances. In the mid-60s, for example, around 90% of all American households already owned a television. In other countries, like Germany at the time, only 60% had the privilege to own a TV set. But Americans were prosperous and they were consuming. The resulting energy demand for the growing population was increasing at a rapid rate. To meet increasing demands, federal states had to find ways to provide more electricity. Nuclear power plants were built basically all over the country. Pennsylvania also saw its future in nuclear power and approved the construction of new reactors. Nuclear power plants require a lot of water and are therefore often built near rivers. In 1968, Pennsylvania approved the construction of a nuclear power plant on a small river island at the banks of Susquehanna River. The island is called 3 Mile Island. It is located near Harrisburg, and the nearest community was about 3 miles away, the nearest city, which was Harrisburg, about 10 miles away. The owner of this power plant, the Metropolitan Edison Company, belonged to General Public Utilities. And the company was responsible for the operation of this 3 Mile Island nuclear power plant. After 6 years of construction, the first of the 2 reactors were commissioned in 1974. The second, slightly larger one, was connected to the grid on December 30th, 1978. Pressurized water reactors were used in both power plants. Such type of reactors use nuclear energy to generate large quantities of steam. The steam is then sent through turbines, which in turn drive generators to produce electricity. Technically, it works very similar to a simple steam engine. But for safety reasons, obviously, nuclear power plants require 2 water circuits. One is self-contained and remains exclusively within the reactor vessel because the cooling water is radioactive, and the second water circuit is separate and does not mix with the radioactive cooling water. This is to prevent radioactive water from exiting the reactor. Only the second water circuit drives the turbines. The water vapor then condenses and cools the reactor again in the return flow. This keeps the reactor at operating temperature, which is important to prevent overheating. To understand the error chain, we have to start the day before. Because 11 hours prior to the accident, maintenance technicians had been working on this very pipeline. The water for the non-radioactive circuit comes from the Susquehanna River and has to be filtered so that the pipes do not become clogged. These filters also need to be cleaned regularly, which was attempted during the maintenance inspection on the previous day. Unfortunately, the deposits could not be removed sufficiently. The technicians assumed that they just need to pump the water back into the pipes with sufficient pressure. The dirt should then simply disappear. But for unknown reasons, water and residue got into the control line of the pumps unnoticed. A few hours later, the pumps suddenly switched off. As the pumps had now failed, cooling water did not flow back into the reactor vessel. As a result, the water temperature around the reactor core increased rapidly. The water pressure exceeded its limit, and the emergency valve for excess pressure opened, allowing the coolant to escape from the reactor. Then the reactor shut down automatically and immediately stopped supplying electricity. So far, the system reacted and worked as planned and as designed. From the technician's perspective, the situation wasn't critical because emergency systems were in place for exactly such situations. But they did not notice that the pressure in the reactor vessels rose and that water evaporated. The emergency valve should have closed again once the excess pressure had escaped, but it was stuck and remained opened. Instead, the control room display showed the valve closed, as it wasn't designed to indicate a mechanical condition. This was a huge technical flaw. 2 shift supervisors were called in to help. They stood helplessly in front of the control panels, surrounded by countless flashing warning lights. The control center was in chaos, with flashing warning lights and alarm signals echoing through the room. Technicians frantically searched for this cause but overlooked the fact that the emergency valve for excess pressure remained opened. As a result, the crucial coolant around the reactor began to evaporate, reducing its levels even further. When the first pumps failed, additional emergency pumps should have started immediately. Technicians in the control room noticed that these pumps were running, but they failed to realize that no water was flowing. Shut-off valves for this emergency line had been closed 2 days earlier during maintenance, and there were warning lights in the control room to indicate this. Unfortunately, the technician in charge overlooked 2 other important warning lights. One light was covered by a yellow maintenance label, and the other, which was directly in front of him on the control panel, was likely missed due to his body size. According to the investigation report, the technician's big belly obscured his view of the warning light. At 6 a.m., the shift changed in the control center. The new technicians immediately noticed that the temperature at the emergency valve and in the tanks were dangerously high. To prevent further loss of the cooling water, they closed another shut-off valve. However, by now it was too late. 31,700 gallons of radioactive contaminated water and gases had already escaped. The reactor core reached a temperature of over 2,000 degrees Celsius or 3,600 degrees Fahrenheit. The worst had happened, the nuclear meltdown. 2.5 hours after the pumps failed, radioactivity leaked out. A major alert was issued for the surrounding areas. Here is the call from the nuclear power plant to the authorities.
Oh, man, they got a release inside. 200 R per hour?
Sir. At the top of the dome.
Is that all the numbers you got?
Yeah, those are the only numbers that...
Okay. Boy, keep us posted. That's a serious damn event.
It was evident from the very first call that this was a serious incident. It is only by a fortunate coincidence that this occurrence did not escalate into a nuclear catastrophe, as has occurred in Chernobyl or Fukushima. This event is still considered the worst reactor accident in the USA. It became known as the 3 Mile Island accident. The radiation alarm was triggered almost 3 hours after the incident began, shortly before 7 o'clock in the morning. The core meltdown had already begun. At this point, the radiation levels in the primary cooling water were around 300 times higher than permitted. The building was severely contaminated. A total meltdown and a full nuclear disaster was only prevented because new coolant was fed into the reactor vessel. Nevertheless, most of the reactor cores were exposed. When a robot was sent into the building months later, all they could see was a black hole in the floor. Nothing of the original structure was recognizable. 28 hours after the incident, Pennsylvania Lieutenant Governor William Scranton stood at a press conference and claimed that everything was under control. He later corrected his statement, saying the situation was more complex than the company initially suggested. There were contradictory statements about the amount of radioactivity released. As a result, all schools in the area were closed and residents were asked to stay in their homes. Even livestock, such as cows, were no longer allowed out in the fields. The Pennsylvania Emergency Management Agency ordered pregnant women and preschool children to evacuate. The evacuation zone was extended from 5 miles to 20 miles on Friday, 3 days after the incident. Within a few days, more than 140,000 people had already fled the area. Shortly after the incident, President Jimmy Carter commissioned a 12-person team to investigate the incident. It took years to fully understand what happened inside Reactor 2. About half of the uranium core melted. Some radioactive gas was released into the environment. Also, the psychological impact was profound. The trust in nuclear power cracked that day and never fully recovered. The investigation commission sharply criticized both the manufacturer and the operator for inadequate maintenance, inadequate quality assurance, insufficient employee training, and a lack of communication of important safety information. The Commission's strongest criticism was that fundamental changes were needed in the organization, processes, and procedures, and above all, in the attitude of management. The measures taken by the operators were, I quote, inappropriate. The technicians acted in accordance with prescribed procedures, but these procedures were inadequate. It was also criticized that the design and structure of the control room was extremely inadequate for dealing with an accident. The investigation committee also found that the identical emergency valve had already failed 11 times previously at other reactors. In 9 of these cases, it was also in the open position. Radioactive coolant escaped each time. In addition, an almost identical incident had occurred 18 months earlier in an identical reactor from the same manufacturer. In this case, however, the reactor had only been operated at 9% of its capacity instead of maximum power. In addition, the employees had solved the problem after 20 minutes and not for almost 2 hours as in the 3 Mile Island nuclear power plant. Despite the manufacturer's engineers being aware of the issue, the company failed to inform its customers promptly about the problem with the emergency valves. I find it somehow astonishing that the time of the incident and thus the fatigue of the technicians involved was never investigated in any of the various occurrences. When comparing different incidents such as the Chernobyl disaster or the Bhopal accident, serious errors took place in the middle of the night. I don't think that we should be surprised if fatigue played a role, at least as a contributing factor. According to official information, there were no health consequences for the population. However, an independent study proved that residents living downwind of the radioactive gas and vapor cloud had cancer rates up to 150% higher than other comparison groups. Also, mortality rates in the immediate vicinity of the nuclear power plant was significantly higher. Relatives of the deceased tried to sue the power plant operator, Metropolitan Edison Company. The amount of financial compensation was, however, never disclosed. Dismantling of the reactor took around 15 years and cost almost $1 billion. Final dismantling was then interrupted indefinitely for cost reasons. During the entire 20 years, if you at the time of construction and dismantling, the pressurized water reactor was in operation for exactly 3 months. The 3 Mile Island accident wasn't caused by one catastrophic failure. It was a cascade of small mistakes: a stuck valve, a misleading indicator, a decision to turn off the backup cooling, a training program that didn't fully prepare operators for complex emergencies. It's the classic pattern we see here in Error 1. The system was working until it wasn't. The people were trained, but not for this. And the warning signs were there, but no one knew how to read them. In the aftermath, the US nuclear industry changed. New regulations were passed and operator training was overhauled. Emergency response protocols became stricter. This incident shows once again that minor errors occur long before a major accident. In this case, a safety valve that regularly jammed. Far too rarely are these errors taken seriously or measures derived to prevent a larger error chain. Error 1 was known long before the accident, but nothing was done to prevent it. And this concludes episode 7 of Error 1. Thank you again for listening. If you found today's story compelling, please leave a review and share the episode with someone who remembers the 70s or someone who thinks technology never fails. If you want to learn more about this concept, you can now download my award-winning book, Error 1, or just visit www.error1.net. With this in mind, I say thank you very much. As we say in Germany, bleiben Sie sicher, stay safe, and talk to you next time.